Okay, hello. And for today, I will talk about the very first step when you're doing or starting your consulting engagement with a particular client, and that is framing the problem. Now, you might notice in this particular lecture and in the future lectures, the other lectures concerning consulting engagement, is that the steps seem to be very simple. Okay, they seem to be like no-brainer concepts, right? Like, why on earth should we consider about framing the problem as if it were like a very scientific, very rigorous concept, right? I mean, I'm sure when you were much younger, you've been trained to understand problems. And not only that, you've actually been trained to solve problems. So when you look at this first step in the consulting engagement process, you might be thinking, framing the problem? Does that really deserve dedicated time and attention in our study of consulting? Okay. Well, as you might realize, I mean, some of you may not realize it now, but for those who've been doing consulting for quite some time, you will understand that sometimes this is the very first thing that people neglect to do properly. And there were some cases wherein consultants, well, they're not really consultants, but maybe they've just been asked to sell a certain product, and all they've been doing is just really pushing product, which is not consulting. Okay. Naturally, if you recall, the idea of consulting is that we're here to help solve a problem, okay, that is faced by the client. But before you can actually solve a problem, well, you need to identify what that problem is. Okay. And also, later on, you will realize that there are many problems, many challenges faced by the client. So it becomes a bolder question, which problem do I address? Do I address all of them? Do I only address one of them? Or some of them? Well, that's something that you really have to answer correctly. And this is why this step, framing the problem, is actually very, very important in consulting. Now, we'll share some basic ideas, okay? And then we'll look a little bit on structure and how we frame the problem. And then the idea here is that when you begin to frame a problem, eventually you need to have a guess on what the solution to the problem is. Okay, and that guess, we call that to be the hypothesis. Okay, in some cases, your hypothesis would be spot on. But eventually, in some other cases, it's not exactly accurate. Okay, you could even be wrong in your first attempt at a good hypothesis. Okay, and then we'll wrap up this particular lecture afterwards. So, what are the basic ideas? If you can't solve problems in a structured, hypothesis driven manner, you're unlikely to make it through. Now, for some consultants, maybe some of them are quite talented. And perhaps there's this idea that they can solve problems very intuitively. Okay, that does happen. I mean, there are people gifted with such skills. But if you really want to be successful in consulting for a very, very long time, naturally there has to be some structure. And obviously, if it is hypothesis driven, perhaps you've heard of this term in the scientific method, okay, which is also a structured way of trying to arrive at answers. Okay, so you have a hypothesis, you will test your hypothesis eventually. I'll talk more about that in the future lectures. But definitely, if you don't have a structure, you're not going to follow something like of a scientific method in your consulting practice, then the likelihood that you will be successful in it is pretty low. Okay? A problem solving process begins with the use of structured frameworks to generate fact-based hypotheses followed by data gathering and analysis to prove or disprove the hypothesis. Now, from this statement alone, you know that, okay, it's a pretty long process. Okay, definitely you have to make some effort, particularly in data gathering, right? In gathering facts, all throughout the process. We'll talk more about these things later on, and the focus for now is just really understanding what the problem is. Okay. So, structure. Although we often use the term fact-based to describe it, the problem-solving process begins not with facts, but with structure. Um, this is a little bit debatable, perhaps in some academic circles, right? For example, excuse me, in economics, there has been some sort of a school of thought wherein they look at facts first, they look at data, and then by looking at the data, there's this premise that you let the data speak for itself. Okay? You let the data come up with the story. That's more or less a school of thought. But really, more than anything else, aside from those exceptional cases in the academic world, really problem solving doesn't really start with facts. It starts with some structure in mind. However, facts will also become a very key component of your process. Okay, it's just that okay, from the get go, you need to have some structure in mind. Okay, what's a good example of a structure? Well, the scientific method is a good structure. Okay, a framework is a good structure. And structure can refer to particular problem-solving frameworks, or more generally, to defining the boundaries of a problem and then breaking it down into component elements. Um, you might be trying to address some issues, okay, that is given, but without a framework, you might end up spending too much time trying to solve everything, and the likelihood that you will solve something drops exponentially. Okay, at least by having some framework, you're able to do some sort of a divide and conquer approach. You're trying to ensure that things are a little bit orderly, they're a little bit neat in terms of your approach. And later on, you realize that certain structures won't allow you to address everything. And you find out that that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. With either approach, structures allow consultants to come rapidly to grips with the issues facing them and enables them to form initial hypotheses about possible solutions. The facts, as we will see, will come later. Now, when we're talking about structure, there are three things that we want to keep in mind. Okay, so the first is feel free to be me-see. We'll talk about what me-see stands for. Second idea is don't reinvent the wheel. Okay, so if there is a situation in the past that would be helpful in your case, make use of it. And lastly, under structure, is that every client is unique. So they have their own concerns, they have their own ideas. And not every solution would be applicable for everyone. You realize that. Now, feel free to be messy. What do we mean by this? Well, structure is vital to any fact-based problem-solving process. Okay, we get that. The concept of messy, it means mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, is the basic tenet of the thought process. Now, uh, the idea here is that when we try to be messy, okay, we look at the entire problem, and then we try to decompose that problem into distinct, non-overlapping issues, making sure that no issues relevant to your problem have been overlooked. Okay, so the mutually exclusive refers to, okay, if I have a big thing that I want to decompose, to chop down into smaller parts, well, I have to make sure that each part can stand on its own in terms of academic analysis, perhaps. Okay. However, the idea there is that when you've chopped everything up into smaller parts, okay, you want to make sure that everything that has to be considered is being considered. Okay. So the non-overlapping characteristic, that is the mutually exclusive part. That making sure that everything has been considered, that no stone is left unturned, that is the collectively exhaustive part. So that's the me-see there. Okay. So looking at that problem, okay, and then understanding, okay, how do I chop up this problem into smaller parts? Okay, I chop it up into smaller parts, making sure each part doesn't really overlap one another. There could be some relationships, that is fine, but the idea there is that when you take a look at one part, they can stand on its own. Okay. Now, the second idea is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Okay. Your organization may have its own frameworks. If you're part of a consulting company, okay, there are probably some tools, some methodologies, okay, in place, and you should take advantage of them if possible. Otherwise, and only then, if there's nothing available, that you consider developing your own problem solving tool based on your experience. And lastly, understanding that every client is unique. Okay, frameworks, while they look very fancy, they look neat, they look snappy, well, they're not magic bullets. They won't solve your problem. Remember, we're just still at the first stage, which is defining or framing the problem. Okay, we're not yet there in terms of really coming up with a solution. So the framework is a start, but it's not your finish. Okay, and you must know that every client is unique. Okay, the current situation that the client is facing, it's possible that that is only experienced by that client and that client alone. Okay, you may have seen something similar in the past. As you build experience, you'll probably realize, okay, this looks something similar to a client, to another client that I've worked with last year or last year. Okay, well, it is possible that while there are some similarities, it is not the same. So understand that trying to squeeze every organization's problems through appropriate frameworks will only get you so far. Okay. There's this saying, different strokes with different folks. Okay? So what may work with some may not work for others. Okay? But is this a criticism of frameworks? Okay? No. You still need them to start with something. But if you're going to finish them, then you need to put in the work. And that's where the facts come into the picture. They help complete that picture. The framework, they're just like scaffolding. They're like a skeleton, right? But skeleton alone won't give you the human being, right? I mean, the skeleton needs to be embodied with muscles, with tissue, okay, with organs, okay, with organ systems, okay. So a skeleton is not enough, okay. Sorry, in this case, a framework is not enough to do effective consulting work. Okay. So how do we go about with this, with structure? What are the usual tips? How do we implement? When okay, we have a structure, okay, we need to have a structure to start off with framing the problem. Or what do we do? Well, without structure, your ideas won't stand up. And you use structure to strengthen your thinking. Okay, so without structure, your ideas won't stand up. Okay, so think about your company and the way you and your colleagues formulate and present business ideas. Okay, so start off with that. If you don't have any framework in mind yet, well, how do you go about with your business and doing consultancy? Okay, so you ask yourselves these questions. Okay, do you use a consistent structure? Or at least emphasize the need for internal coherence and logic in your problem solving? So is there a methodology in place? Are you guys using something rigorous? Or do people usually arrive at decisions ad hoc? You know, like feeling something in the air, you know, like sticking up their fingers up and coming up with the answers intuitively, like some sort of divine intervention. How do you guys do it at the start? I mean, if you're starting your consulting business, then obviously you know that you need to have some structure. But if you're part of an organization already that does consulting, does your organization have a methodology in place that you can use? Okay? Or is there none? Okay. Well, it would be a bit surprising if you are working in a consulting company that does not have any structure in place. That's a little bit tricky. I mean, you probably would want to ask how successful is this organization in terms of consulting. You'll probably start being skeptical about their sustainability, okay, or their success even, okay, in consulting. Now, most of us are not blessed from birth with the ability to think in a rigorous, structured manner. We have to learn how. Okay, so if you realize there's no structure in place, well, you just have to learn how. But you wouldn't be really lost. Of course, it's still possible. There could be a few people, if until at this point they still don't have an idea of what structure to use. Okay, for those who've gone through university education, at least you've encountered many frameworks, the more basic ones, like the scientific method. That's a good structure. You're studying in IT, for example. I mean, you would have encountered a lot of methodologies that would somehow make sense. But yeah, I mean, there will be a case wherein somebody is not exactly fortunate enough to have encountered structures in their work life. Okay, well, now you realize there has to be some structure, so you have to allow that person to really learn through it. Okay. Now, unfortunately, that skill is not part in most university curricula, and few companies have the resources and the inclination to teach it to their employees. In fact, it becomes more of a recruitment requirement. But then you probably lose out great opportunities. Maybe they just didn't have anything structured in mind, but once you train these people, they could be very, very good performers, right? So you lose out talent in that way as well. Nevertheless, there's always that risk that people may not have had formal education in this area. They probably don't have any structured ideas, okay, in the very first place. Now, okay, many highly successful organizations don't apply structured thought even to their core competencies. I mean, you don't be surprised if you go to a company, especially if the company is not a very large, very successful IT company, for example, and they don't even have anything structured. They don't have a methodology. Okay, that happens also with some local companies, with startups especially. There's no structure in mind. Okay, that's fine. Okay, now if structured thinking is hard to find at the world's most respected and successful companies, one can imagine it can be pretty rare in many other organizations. Okay, so don't be shocked to realize if your company, okay, eventually you realize there's no methodology in place. Okay, well, propose. And if they'd like you to do some sort of a proof of concept before you do anything else, okay, well, go ahead, try it out. Have us have some methodology in mind. Okay. But you know what? I mean, not only do these things exist, right? Not only do organizations without structure exist. You know, sometimes you'd be surprised as to why they continue to persist. Okay, in not having a structure. An example of that would be culture. Okay, further complicating matters, corporate cultures of some organizations have been imbued with the wrong types of structure. So, okay, there's some structure, but the structure may not be appropriate, right? May not even work. Okay, to the point that people would pay lip service to the structure, but in reality, they're not doing anything about it. Okay. Now, obviously, between inappropriate thinking processes and the complete absence of structured thought, there appears to be a lot of room for someone to add value. Okay, so if you're faced with a case, there's no structure, zero methodology, versus some structure, but there's a lot of deficiency there. Okay, regardless of your circumstance, there's always an opportunity for you to improve on the status quo. And another tip for us to be able to get structure going, as part of our consulting practice is using structure to strengthen your own thinking. The thing here is that don't expect organizations to lay it down on a silver platter for everyone's consumption, right? I mean, that wouldn't work. Um, and the thing there is that if you're very much convinced on the idea of starting off with a structure when you start off with your consulting practice, then you realize that you need to use some sort of structure for yourself. So it has to be like a personal advocacy of some type. Okay, so in all sorts of places, okay, whether in a big company, startup, even NGOs, okay, charitable or institutions, consultants have been able to apply structured thinking in ways that allow them to add value to their organizations. I mean, that's what we've said about consultants, right? And consultancy in general. I mean, you need to be able to add value to your clients. Okay? And for you to be able to do that, you realize that you need to have some structure in place. Okay. What's an example here? Well, for example, making strategic decisions require understanding the capabilities of your organization and how to utilize those capabilities to maximize performance. Now, large organizations might seem the ideal place to apply these techniques, okay? But maybe you might be thinking, I want to build my career as a consultant, but then you realize, well, maybe it doesn't make sense for me to do it in a small company, but why don't I go to a large established company? What might surprise you even is sometimes the smaller players, okay? Those without cash, those without resources, those without time at their disposal. You know, they're also places, they're also environments wherein you can actually exercise structure, and you might even have an opportunity to come up with something more developed in that situation. Now, regardless of where you find yourself in, if you find yourself in a multinational company, or if you find yourself in, in, in a startup or in a small company, well, having some structured thinking can really add value, okay, outside of the confines of the business world. You can even use it personally. Okay, in your personal lives, you realize that sometimes structured thinking is important, will always be important. As we've seen, structured thinking is an important element in any business person's problem solving arsenal. So, how do we use this weapon? Well, first, you must understand that structure doesn't exist in a vacuum. So, we don't look at structure for structure's sake. I mean, we're discussing structure now as some sort of a prerequisite when we're going to tackle a problem, but they're not there in some isolation. Okay, they're not there as if independent of everything else. Okay, they're important, yes, and you need them to be able to support everything else. Okay, so naturally you need to wield it with a goal in mind. Later on, you realize which structures won't work and which structures will. Okay, that would depend on your objectives. Okay, in the context of framing and solving business problems, your goal is to bring order out of chaos. Okay, so and that's the role of structure. Now, today's executives and entrepreneurs have access to far more information than they can possibly use. They can manage this surfeit of data only by filtering out all but the most relevant facts. Okay. The appropriate structured framework will allow you to do this much more efficiently, thereby increasing the probability that you will arrive at a solution in a reasonable amount of time and add value to your business. The beauty of structure is that it helps you become organized. Okay. And with the abundance of concerns that you will be faced, not only as a consultant, but maybe as a professional or even as someone outside of work. I mean, it's good that you need to have a good structure in place to keep everything working efficiently. Okay? And if you're able to work efficiently, then okay, at least in the concept of work, you'll get more clients because you're now able to address their issues quickly. Okay. At the same time, it gives you that sense of credibility. It gives you that brand, so to speak, that you are somebody who is competent, quite credible, able to solve things, and yeah, I mean, add value to the business of your clients. Now, when we look at management, okay, the role of senior management in the structure, okay, is to structure reality in order to make it easily graspable. Well, the idea of senior management here is that they're supposed to give the context. They're supposed to give the background as to why certain things are being done. Okay, and actually that can be the start of the fact gathering or the data gathering that you're expected to do eventually. Right. So they put some proper grounding first for that. Okay. But more often than not, senior management are the ones responsible for you executing what you need to do for consulting, right? So they just give you the context, they just give you the background, they give you some motivations perhaps or drivers as to why they want certain things done. Okay. Now, executives do this by defining the scope of the problem at hand in order to see all its ramifications, the links to other factors, and the scope of consequences. And again, like I said a while ago, you might be faced with so many issues, so many problems that you will be tempted to solve all of them. Well, this is also the role of the executives and senior management. They tell you more or less the boundaries of what you can do or what you should be focused on. Okay, that you shouldn't be too worried about the little things, those that don't really add value. They can tell you that, and you'll appreciate their inputs as you're trying to define the problem. Okay, and because they have a good visibility of what's really important for the organization, they can then discard unimportant factors and concentrate on prioritizing the options available to the organization. So they know how to prioritize. They know how to make that decision that says that okay, I need to do this or I can do that. Okay. That's the whole idea. And it also allows them to communicate the problem, okay, which is potentially complex, and its solution in easily understandable terms to make it clear to those who need to execute management's directives. So they're very important. I mean, later on, you'll realize the value of really reaching out to the stakeholders. And we've talked about this earlier as to understanding who the real client is. Senior management becomes part of your audience, okay? They could be your indirect clients, so to speak, right? But they're still important. They can still provide input to what it is that you need to be doing as a consultant. Now, in the generic approach to framing the problem, consultants put this concept into practice by breaking the problem before them into component elements. So you chop up the problem, chop up the big problem so that you have smaller problems. Okay, you see that done in most situations, and that sort of works. Okay, but why is that the approach? Well, in most cases, a complex problem can actually be reduced to a group of smaller, simpler problems that can be solved individually. Okay, separating the pieces of the problem will make it easier for you and your team to identify the key drivers of the problem and focus your analysis accordingly. It's even possible that you would be able to, solve the individual parts first without having to harass yourselves with the others. Okay, and that's actually good. In fact, it's a good motivation when you see that you're able to solve the little problems first. Okay, you see, wow, I'm able to solve this problem, I'm able to solve that problem, solve another problem. Okay, and before you know it, you've been able to snowball all of your solutions, and then you have a final solution for everything. Okay, and that's a good motivation. That's progress also. Okay, so this technique, okay, works not only for business problems, but for other complex problems in other realms, such as politics. Okay, so we're not going to go into that. Now, how do we apply this idea? How do we try to break down the bigger problem into smaller problems? Well, the most common tool consultants use to break problems apart is what is known as the logic tree. Okay? The logic tree is a hierarchical listing of all the components of a problem. Okay, starting from a 20,000-foot view, moving progressively downwards. Now, so you have a logic tree. Maybe at the root is like your problem, the massive problem, and then you think of, okay, this massive problem what would be its immediate parts? Maybe you come up with five, A, B, C, D, E, for the sake of argument. Okay, and then you realize for part A, okay, how can I solve part A? And then you realize, well, part A can actually be decomposed into smaller parts. A1, A2, A3, A4. Okay, you continue doing that. And as you picture it visually, you will have something like a tree. Okay. There's no hard and fast rule on how you do the logic tree. It's just a stylized label for a simple tool that everyone can use. Okay. Now, if you have a big problem and if you can decompose it into smaller problems and then decompose those smaller problems into much smaller problems, then you have a good idea. The idea there is that once you solve the smallest of problems and you roll them up, you're actually able to solve the original big problem that you really wanted to address. Now, when employing logic trees or any framework, bear in mind your eventual audience. Okay, sometimes as IT people or as engineers, you're too obsessed with the beauty of the technical stuff that when you start to present it to other people, you sort of lose track. And then I say, oh, okay, I mean, I don't think you start to lose your train of thought, or you lose focus that, hey, I probably need to explain these things first. Okay, because they're not really like me, like an IT person or engineer. Okay, you can have that. You can have that issue. So first thing that you have to keep in mind is tailor your presentation of that framework accordingly. And finally, remember that structure is only the beginning. We've kept on saying that earlier. And you need to develop a strong hypothesis, devise and perform the right analysis to draw your conclusions and communicate those conclusions effectively. So the framework is just a start. Okay? It gives you some tools. Okay, we've talked about the logic tree. Okay, you'll probably see that more in the references available for you. But nevertheless, okay, after you've set up the structure, so what's the next part of this particular step? Well, you have to understand that you need to construct what is known as your hypothesis. You need to have some sort of a guess on what the solution to the problem might be. Okay. Now, having reduced the problem to its essential components, okay, through the use of appropriate frameworks, okay, structure, now you're ready to embark on the next step, the process of framing the problem, which is forming a hypothesis as to its likely solution. Now, the hypothesis is not necessarily the answer. It's just an initial guess on what the answer might be. You could be right, you could also be wrong. The idea there is that if you find out that your hypothesis isn't exactly the solution, you can always tweak it, you can always make adjustments, a little bit of updating here and there, no problem. Now, what are some tips in order for us to go through the hypothesis, right? Well, first is solving the problem at the first meeting. Okay. Proper prior preparation. Okay, so we'll talk about what types of preparation is needed in a white room. Okay, what do we mean by a white room? So we'll talk about that in a while. And here, the problem is not always the problem. Now, first up, solve the problem at the first meeting. Now, consultants learn that it is much more efficient to analyze the facts of a problem with the intent of proving or disproving a hypothesis than to analyze those facts one by one to determine which answer they will eventually provide. You know, you can think of it as, if you're familiar with the agile methodology or Scrum, right? You just go ahead, try to solve that problem right away. Take a stab at it. And then later on, you'll find out that, okay, as you go through it, you realize, oh, that's not the correct way of doing it. You do something else. Okay? As opposed to, say, sitting back, relaxed, trying to look at it in some sort of, like you're building a cathedral, right? The problem with building cathedrals is that you probably have a nice blueprint, but it will probably take you 200 years to build your cathedral. Oh, I mean, that looks nice. People will like you, but 200 years, you're probably not. I have not heard of anyone who survived 200 years to actually see their ideas come to life, right? So there. Now, and that's the reason why you need to have a hypothesis so that you have a good start. Okay. It provides you and your team with a problem-solving roadmap. Okay, that will lead you to the right to that will lead you, sorry, to ask the right questions and perform the correct analysis to get your answer. Now, a good hypothesis will also save you time by pointing out potential blind alleys much more quickly and allowing you to get back to the main issues if you don't uh, get it right. Okay. Uh, Again, that's the idea, like with the problem solving method, known as the scientific method, right? And that's how scientific method works. I mean, you look at it, you 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 have a hypothesis. Okay, you conduct your experiments, and then what happens? Okay, you find out, you analyze. Did it answer your problem, or were there some things that you missed out? Okay, and you act accordingly. Do you revise your hypothesis? Do you redo your experiments? Okay. So that's the same idea here. You probably need to have a good hypothesis at the start, and if it is really really good, then okay, uh, that's quite beneficial for you. So and you proceed. But if you realize that your hypothesis is not exactly correct, okay, you step back, take a look at what needs to be done. Okay, and then you solve it right away. Okay, make the adjustments. Now, another idea here is that you generate your initial hypothesis, okay, by drawing conclusions based on the limited facts you know about the problem at hand without doing a lot of research. Okay, well, remember, it's a hypothesis. It's not yet your final answer, right? So definitely, your ideas will be based on some things that you already have available to you. But then you realize as you're working with your hypothesis that you're missing data. You need to gather more. Well, that's now you know what to do next, right? So, I mean, again, the idea of the hypothesis, coming up with some initial guess on what the solution might be, should lead you to actually do what you need to do next. Okay. Now, I mean, how do you go about with drawing out initial conclusions based on limited facts? Well, if you're new to the industry, you might be spending some time reading articles, annual reports, anything published. You might have to go through. Later on, we'll talk about the techniques about interviews, questionnaires. We'll go through that. But someone who might be experienced in that industry might have some ideas already. Okay. Ideally, you'd probably would want to spend an hour or two meeting with your teammates and hashing out some likely answers to the problem. So you try to, just some initial ideas. Again, it need not solve the problem right away. Okay. If by off chance you're able to solve the problem already, that's good for you. But remember, the objective is to just have a starting point. And based on that starting point, your hypothesis, that would lead you to what you need to do next, right? Eventually, you'll come up with the answers from that. Now, your next step is to figure out which analysis you have to perform and which questions you have to ask in order to prove or disprove your hypothesis. Okay. So one way to lay out these questions is with an issue tree. So earlier we were talking about the logic tree. So that's the structure and how we can decompose a big problem into a smaller problem. Now we talk about an issue tree. Now an issue tree, okay, it's like a logic tree. It bridges the gap between structure and hypothesis. Okay, so here in this case, I mean, the issue tree would, okay, tell you what the subsequent issues might be. Right? So if you have one big issue, what might be the sub-issues that you need to address? Okay. Now, every issue generated by a framework is likely to be reducible to sub-issues. And these in turn may break down into smaller and smaller issues. So the issue tree rather, is simply the laying out of issues and sub-issues into a messy visual progression. Okay. It's like a logic tree. Okay. Again, your issue tree is that you have a big problem. Why don't you decompose it into smaller problems? By answering the questions in your issue tree, you can very quickly determine the validity of your hypothesis. So you try to answer very quickly. Okay, if you're able to have this massive question, and then you have those sub questions, and you try to answer those sub questions, okay, then you have some ideas already on whether your initial hypothesis is correct or not. Now, okay, so that's the first step, making some sort of an attempt to solve the problem at the first glance. Now, what's next? Proper prior preparation. Okay, consultant teams rely on brainstorming to develop and test their initial hypothesis. Okay, brainstorming, however, requires that all team members come to the meeting prepared. So, yeah, you know that you want to come up with a good hypothesis the first time around, but you don't just simply do it in a brusque way, in a sloppy way. I mean, you need to have some sort of preparation also. Even at that level, there has to be some structure. Okay. So each one, if you're part of a team, okay, everybody has to prepare. But if you're working alone, well, obviously, before you can come up with a good hypothesis, then there has to be some level of preparation also. Okay. Sometimes, especially for team leaders, it helps if individuals have their own initial hypothesis already developed. Okay. So that the team can bat them around, but it's not essential. Okay. I mean, if you're working in a team, you're working for a single client, okay, you could have many possible hypotheses. Okay, that's quite likely. And in fact, that's quite encouraged because now you're looking at the diversity of positions. Okay? You'll come up with a richer, consolidated hypothesis eventually. Okay, but again, we talked about hypothesis as not being the answer. Well, when you go into such meetings, don't come into them thinking that you know the answer. Okay, be prepared to learn. Again, scientific method. You have the hypothesis. You're there to learn. Okay, you're there to learn. And then you put it in a white room. Let's say in a white room, there's no preconceived notions. Of course, physically speaking, you want to be in a room that is quite bare, no distractions, definitely. But the idea of a white room is that you don't need to have biases when you come in to the brainstorming session. You need to be clear of your biases. You need to be clear of your perhaps favoritism or anything of that sort, preconceptions. Okay? You don't need all of that when you're doing brainstorming. So it's about generating good ideas. So leave your preconceptions at the door. Everyone in the meeting must be able to speak his mind and share his knowledge. Okay? Creating that safe space for everyone to share their ideas without being criticized, without being ridiculed or laughed at. Okay? So that's the idea of the white room. Very clean, no preconceptions at the start, okay? Just go there with the eagerness to learn. Okay? Naturally, there are some rules that you need to follow when you're doing brainstorming. These are some of them, okay? Just understand that they could be many. There could be other rules, okay? The whole idea there is that everybody is or should feel safe and secure to express their ideas. I think that's the root of it. So all brainstorming rules should support that objective, that everyone should be able to speak up, and everyone shouldn't be scared to speak up out of fear of being embarrassed or ridiculed or insulted with whatever it is that they share. And naturally, you have to make sure that everything that's shared is properly documented. Okay, it's not just a simple session where like of a slurp of tea, in the middle of a tea shop. Okay, and that's it. I mean, you have to. I mean, you have to write things down. Definitely, you have to document all of your ideas. So typically, in a white room, you'd probably see some flip chart papers. Okay, I mean, you write something down. Okay, and somebody collects it. Nowadays, people take pictures of these things. So the hassle of having to bring paper is minimized, is reduced. Okay. But you also need to have some structure also. So yeah, there's brainstorming, you'd allow everyone to speak up, but you should also know when to stop. You should know when to say that, okay, we've gathered enough, okay, that's it. We're okay. We don't wait indefinitely. We don't try to squeeze people until the very end, and you spend probably like 1 week just doing brainstorming. If you think about it, probably the client is not a very difficult client to deal with, right? So you probably just need something simple for your client, and that's it. So you don't really need anything complicated at this stage. And same thing with brainstorming. You don't really need anything very complicated. Okay. Now, and then the last tip here for hypothesis is that knowing that the problem is not always the problem. Okay, every consultant really faces the temptation of taking the client's diagnosis of his problem at face value. So, of course, well, as a consultant, you might be asking your client, "Oh, what do you think the problem might be?" Well, that's a good point, right? I mean, maybe the client has some idea on what the problem might be, so don't hesitate to ask. But you shouldn't take everything at face value. You shouldn't believe whatever your client would say. Remember, the reason why you're being pulled in, okay, the honest answer to that is that you are supposed to add value to them. So if you're not able to be comfortable in challenging their assumptions, okay, especially in their initial diagnosis of the problem, then you're probably not worth the consultant that they're looking into, right? You probably don't need a consultant. Okay, and just as a patient is not always aware of the meaning of his symptoms, so are managers sometimes incorrect in their diagnosis of what ails their organization. Okay. Now it's tough. Sometimes the client can be very, very forceful, right? Type A personality, aggressive, gets what he wants. Right? You could meet clients like those. And you should always resist the temptation to take everything at face value. Okay, remember, you're there. You're there to help solve a problem. If your client already thought he has solved the problem already, then you're not needed, right? Okay, now the only way to determine whether the problem you have been given is a real problem is to dig deeper. Go further. Do some sort of forensic analysis. Ask more questions. Get the facts. Okay, do proper investigation. That's what you do. And that's what you're paid to do, okay, by your client. So sometimes, being skeptical at the start is good. You know? And the reason why you're skeptical is not because you're trying to discredit your client, right? Or putting your client down and say, you're just a client. You don't know anything. I mean, you don't do that. That's not the reason why you want to be skeptical. Remember, the reason why you're skeptical, and it should be some healthy skepticism, is that you want to learn. Right? The only way for people to learn is that if they're skeptical somehow at the start, right? And then through that skepticism, you then do your own investigation and come up with the solution, okay, with the discovery, with the realization, okay? So in this case, the healthy skepticism that's required of consultants is that, okay, they're there to learn. You have a guess on what the problem might be, and you test something out, okay? But you don't just simply take lock, stock, and barrel whatever your client tells you. I don't think that's going to work for you, okay? And what's more, you'll be doing your client a service by getting to the real problem, even if sometimes your client doesn't like it. And sometimes clients don't like it because it can be an embarrassing situation. Sometimes it's a shot to their ego, thinking that they know what the problem might be, that they realize, no, that's not a problem. Okay. So the real issue is not really the problem, but their egos, right? It does happen. And because it happens, it doesn't mean that it's correct. Okay? It's just that you have to be aware of the possibility that some clients may get hurt. Okay? Some clients may not like to hear what they will hear from you. But let me tell you, if these are good clients in the sense that they're really honest in making themselves better, eventually they will get you. Eventually they will listen to you. So don't lose hope, especially if the clients can be very, very difficult. Okay, because if they're really honestly looking for help, then they will appreciate your inputs. Now naturally there's a flip side to that. I mean, you can't be heavy-handed also in your inputs. You can't just shove it in their face and say, oh, this is the problem, you don't know anything. You can't be like that. You need to communicate that well. Okay. Yeah, so that's one aspect, okay, about that the problem is not always the problem. Now, we've talked about forming hypothesis as part of framing the problem. So how do we start doing these things, right? How do we go about in implementing this? Well, a hypothesis-based decision making has proved extremely portable. Okay, it's robust. If you're wrong in your hypothesis, you can change. Okay, You don't need a lot of resources to implement. You can test a little bit, and if you've realized you've gone astray, then you can make some adjustments, right? It can be done in teams, but if need be, you can do it on your own. I mean, you can do it alone. Okay, and it is applicable in a wide spectrum of problems. You don't need to be like an expert in the industry in order for you to use hypothesis, right? Now, what are the things to remember? Well, an initial hypothesis saves you time. And an initial hypothesis will make your decision making more effective. Okay. So again, going back to that idea that trying to solve the problem at the first instance, at the first meeting. Okay. So an initial hypothesis will save you time. Okay. You won't struggle to really look for something. You have some sort of a guide to move things around. And with an initial hypothesis, you can make your decision making more effective. You can already structure the scope of how you're going to operate. Okay. Now, what do we mean by saving time? Okay. Most people, when faced with a complex problem, will start at the beginning and wade through all the data until they come to an end, the solution. Straightforward. That happens. There's nothing wrong with that. You'll probably get the same solution. Okay, and this is sometimes known as the deductive approach. Pretty much what you do in, let's say, math problems. You're given a math problem, then you try to solve the math problem, right? Straight up, you know the technique. Okay, you've seen the problem in the past when you've been working on exercises. Okay, so you know how to solve it. Okay, that's the deductive technique. That's deduction. Now, when you form an initial hypothesis, it's the reverse. Okay, so this is induction. Okay, you start with the solution in mind already, the supposed solution, but you're not exactly sure that's the solution, right? So you work yourself backwards. Okay, if this were the solution, then this should happen, and if this should have happened, then this should have happened. So moving all the way backwards. Okay. One reason for this is that by already knowing where your solution is, you eliminate a lot of paths that would probably lead to dead ends. Pretty much what you do with math problems, right? You probably try to solve one, and then all of a sudden you've made a mistake along the way. You'll have to redo everything again. Well, that's the idea of an initial hypothesis. You have a guess in mind, okay? It seems to be logical, then you work backwards. Okay. And then when you go back to the starting point, okay, now you're more convinced that you have a good hypothesis to work on, that this is more likely the solution. Now, forming an initial hypothesis will allow you to work through the labyrinth of your business problem more quickly. I mean, remember, you have so many problems. Even if you decompose them into smaller problems, there's still a lot, right? So you'll have to work on them very quickly. It also saves you time partly because it allows you to start drawing conclusions based on limited information, which at the beginning of the problem solving process is usually what you have. Sometimes the limited information that you have at the start would be everything. You're probably going to be constrained to get more, probably because the client won't allow you to get more information, or there are certain things that are not yet existing yet. Okay, maybe it's still way in the future. Okay, let's say in the case of forecasting work. Okay, but the fact that you have some material already at the start shouldn't prevent you from doing something already. Go through it. Do it. Okay. And this holds especially true when you're trying to break new ground where nobody has the information you seek. Now, finally, an initial hypothesis saves you time by forcing you and your team to focus only on those issues that can prove or disprove it. They help ground your scope. And this is especially useful for those who have trouble focusing and prioritizing. You may even know of a few such individuals in your organization. Okay, sometimes those who are enamored with the beauty of problems, they can be so absorbed with the complexity of it all to the point that they're not going to do anything. There are people like that. Okay, and you see that very, very prominently in academic circles, in educational institutions, because that's their job, right? It's our job in academia to really concern ourselves with the abstract, right? But when we're working as a consultant, of course, we'll have the same tools as that of an academician, as we said earlier, like the scientific method. But there's a reason why we use that. There's a purpose for that, and the purpose is basically centered on the client. Okay, we have to help the client solve the problem. We need to add value to that client. Okay, and there's a time limit to that. Okay, your client will will not relax and take his or her sweet time, right? You need to be able to prove something right away. Okay? You need to be able to deliver something right away for your client. Now, another tip in trying to, whenever you're trying to work on your hypothesis-driven method is knowing that the initial hypothesis will actually make your decision making more effective. Okay, not only will it make your problem solving faster, more efficient, it allows you to assess multiple options quickly. As a result, your decision making becomes more flexible and therefore more effective. Now, an increased effectiveness in hypothesis based decision making stems from the lesson that the problem is not always the problem, which we just discussed just a while ago. So you know that, you eventually realize, yeah, the problem that you're thinking is not exactly the problem. So, forming an initial hypothesis will make your problem solving more efficient and more effective. But to reap these benefits, you'll need to be able to generate and test robust hypotheses. Okay, you will not be stuck with one. Yes, it's possible that your initial hypothesis might be the correct one, but more often than not, you will have to come up with other hypotheses. You will have to revise, you'll have to tweak. Sometimes you'll have to junk everything and start all over again. That can happen. And since you should form your hypothesis at the start of the problem solving process, you're making guesses. So you're not really going to rely much on facts yet. Okay? You're just making some guesses. Okay? And sometimes it's based on experience, on feel, on intuition. That's what happens. Okay. Now take what you know about the problem at hand, combine it with your intuition, your gut feel about it, and think about the most likely answers. Now, this doesn't mean that the most likely answer is necessarily the correct one, but it is a starting point. Okay. And if you're lucky, if your initial guess is correct, then okay, good for you. Your instincts are pretty sharp to actually get the first guess correct, right? That can happen, especially to the more experienced consultants, but that's not always the case. And even for most experienced consultants, they know that that's not going to be the case. If something leaps out at you immediately, good. Okay, you've just formed the hypothesis at this point, whether you're alone at your desk, standing under the shower, or in a brainstorming session with your team. Okay, you should do what is known as a QDT, or a quick and dirty test of your hypothesis. Now, what does this mean? QDT simply is this. Okay, what assumptions are you making that need to be true in order for your hypothesis to be true? Okay, if any of these assumptions is false, then the hypothesis is false, right? So your hypothesis would have like preconditions. What should these preconditions be, and do they exist? Should they be true? Okay, if you realize that the preconditions are not true, then your hypothesis is not exactly correct. Okay, with much of the time, you can knock out false hypothesis in just a few minutes of the quick and dirty test. And this is especially useful when you need to choose from a few options quickly. Now, your next step is to test your hypothesis. Okay, more thoroughly, and if necessary, you refine your hypothesis. Okay. Now, to accomplish these goals, you should now put together an issue tree, something that we've talked about a while ago. Okay. And in the textbook, you'll be given some examples on how it looks like as well. Now, an issue tree is an evolved cousin of a logic tree. Okay, where the logic tree is simply a hierarchical grouping of elements, right? We are talking about the big problem, chunking them down into smaller problems. An issue tree is a series of questions or issues that must be addressed to prove or disprove a hypothesis. Okay, so it bridges the gap between structure and hypothesis. Okay, every issue generated by a framework is likely to be reducible to sub-issues. And these in turn may break down further. So that's why they look like a tree structure. Okay, by creating an issue tree, you lay out the issues and sub-issues in a visual progression. We talked about it a while ago. This allows you to determine what questions to ask in order to form your hypothesis and serves as a roadmap for your analysis. It also allows you very rapidly to eliminate dead ends in your analysis. Okay, since the answer to any issue immediately eliminates all the branches falsified by that answer. So, in conclusion, okay, by using structured frameworks to create an initial hypothesis, you will enable yourself and your team to select the analysis and areas of research that will allow you to reach a robust conclusion in the shortest possible time. Now, before we get mired into all of these things, okay, the topic of this lecture is actually uh, framing the problem. So, at the end of it all, what is your hypothesis? Your hypothesis is actually the problem. Okay? You are saying that, oh, this is the problem, right? That's what you are trying to set up. Okay? And part of that, upon setting up that conclusion, right? That, okay, this is the problem, you have an idea on how to solve that problem. So all this effort, like trying to have a structure, doing the hypothesis, this is just the first step. You're just trying to identify and frame the problem. And this is, and all these tools are meant to really serve that, okay, end point or that outcome. That you want to be able to say that, okay, this is the problem, this is more or less the solution we're trying to look into. Okay. And with that, that pretty much the, the end of our lecture. Again, if you have any questions about this particular lecture on framing the problem, please don't hesitate to email me or drop me a note, and I'll respond to them shortly. Okay. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening, and see you around. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Goodbye.